Well, it's 2 o'clock, so I'll go ahead and get us started. Thank you, everybody, for coming to our rescheduled session on monitoring and adaptation actions. I hope everybody had a wonderful Memorial weekend and you're coming back refreshed and ready to get started again. So with that, remember everybody mute your line in case you're talking and or there's other background noise, and of course remember to unmute yourself if you want to talk or ask a question. So welcome back. This is the Adaptation Planning and Practices online course. So this week it will be myself, Patricia Leopold, and also Courtney Peterson presenting your lecture. Our agenda today includes a brief recap of step 4, then an introduction to step 5, monitoring. At that point, I'll hand it off to Courtney, who will walk us through a tutorial on using the workbook. And finally, she'll give us a summary of work to be completed before our next class. All right, let's review where we are this week. In our first week, we defined our goals and objectives. Next, we assessed our vulnerabilities and what that really means for our project areas. As a third step, we evaluated our goals and objectives given climate change. And then last week, I think this is everybody's favorite part, we started developing adaptation tactics that address your challenges and capitalize on your opportunities. So this week, you'll be brainstorming ways to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of those selected tactics. And as you start to complete the adaptation workbook, you can also practice exporting your workbook to a PDF or a Word document. And this will help you visualize how each step is helping to communicate your intentional adaptation. I briefly showed you how to do this during our last class, our step 4 class, but please let us know if you need help. It's pretty easy, but that interface can be hard to navigate sometimes. So you can also think about becoming an online demonstration project, and once you've exported your workbook, one of your instructors can easily take that and turn it into a short online demo, and then that same coordinator would be able to update it when you begin implementation or other activities. So even if you feel like you're not ready for implementation yet, we can still get a summary of your work done to date up there and describe what it is you're thinking about doing. And then when you get to the implementation phase, we can update it with more information. So please let us know if you're interested in that. All right, so monitoring. Monitoring is essentially about asking the right question that will help you detect desired conditions over time. There are several different types of monitoring that you'll encounter in science and management. For example, in scientific research, we might have a question and a hypothesis. And with quality replication, we can judge deviation through time. But most of us will find this difficult, and we'll find that it requires many years before we can detect some kind of statistical change. So we don't often use that type of monitoring. Another type of monitoring is impact or response monitoring. This type of monitoring describes changes over time, but it doesn't rigorously support cause and effect. It really consists of these repeated measurements done to specific standards. For example, we use forest inventory and stocking surveys to measure growth, canopy cover, ground cover, survival of planted seedlings, and a number of other factors after we do forest management. Might sound very familiar to a lot of you. Phenology monitoring is another example where you might record the dates of leaf out or bird arrival every spring. This type of monitoring usually attempts to answer a particular question that is relevant to your management goals, But this type of monitoring can be expensive and time consuming as well. So wherever possible, it's a really good idea to piggyback those ideas on existing inventories or surveys. When you already have people out in the field doing work, maybe it's a matter of asking one more question rather than duplicating the whole excursion. And then we have implementation monitoring, which can be useful if we are implementing an action because of climate change and we want to monitor the execution of that action. This is often a yes or no type of observation. And then finally, another type of monitoring is effectiveness. So if you defined the desired effect, did it work? And how will you know if it worked? For example, if you install berms to slow the overland flow of water, after some time, is the water in fact slowed? Yes or no? Does the downhill system become less inundated? These types of questions and this type of monitoring is usually carefully designed based on a conceptual model of the system and supports that cause and effect question over meaningful time periods. So this type of monitoring can also work very well for adaptation. The main task this week is to consider what existing monitoring efforts are available and if they need to be modified to better monitor the results of your adaptation actions. You can also consider what new monitoring items may be required to evaluate whether you have met your management goals. In this step in your adaptation workbook, you first define your monitoring variable. Identify those monitoring items that will be useful to evaluate whether you have achieved your management objectives and goals, or whether you have achieved a milestone that indicates progress toward your goal. When possible, select monitoring items that will also help you to understand whether the adaptation tactics recommended in the previous step were effective in working toward your management goals under climate change. For example, if your tactic is to underplant with future adapted species that are suitable for your system, you may choose to monitor the survival rate of those particular seedlings. This may be different from your standard surveys in that you are monitoring at maybe a higher density, or maybe you're monitoring more frequently than usual because you really want to know how well those seedlings are doing. And then we will next identify a value or a threshold that is meaningful for this monitoring item. So thinking about the units that you're using to measure your metric and what's your target number. Based on the last example, what number of surviving seedlings might represent success? Here we chose the value of 60%. So if we're shooting for 60% survival, that is our criteria for evaluation. And finally, we'll describe how and when this information will be gathered. For example, you may want to monitor your seedling survival every summer for 5 years after planting, or because you might have some new species, maybe it's every year. And remember, it can save time and money if you can take advantage of these existing monitoring surveys or inventories in order to do this work. There are also existing networks like CocoaRise, Rain and Snow and Hail Network, or the National Phenology Network that you might be able to tap into, add your data, and download regional data. So think about other partnerships that can relieve some of the burden of implementation. And if any of you know of other monitoring networks that have been useful to you, please feel free to speak up and let us know. Or type it into the chat box. So some examples of putting this all together. For a particular project, we might decide that we want to monitor 4 different variables. And so one would be invasive species control, another would be regeneration success. We also want to monitor the forest canopy cover, and we want to measure the total suspended solids in our stream cutting through the forest. So if we look at that invasive species control example, our criteria would be areas identified for control have less than 20% cover from invasive species after our management action. And then our implementation would be annual invasive species surveys every year during the late fall to measure whether we have met that target. For the example, regeneration success, we would like to see more than 50% of the desirable species in the 1/2 inch to 2 inch age class. And we'll do a regeneration survey every 2 to 4 years after harvest. And so I'll cover one more example. Forest canopy cover, we're looking at least 60% canopy cover being maintained across all riparian areas. And then for our implementation, we're looking at a forest inventory every 5 years. And so there's a number of different ways to look at how you quantify your monitoring implementation. It might be, you know, a specific date, so-and-so years or months after an action, or it could just be simply before and after. The ultimate outcome here is to develop a realistic and feasible monitoring plan that can be used to help determine whether your management should be altered in the future to account for new information and observations. If something's not working, we can always go back and reevaluate what the situation is and whether we might need to tweak something in our management because our results aren't meeting our expectations. And you've all seen this graphic before, so you should have an idea of the intentionality that each step brings to our climate-informed management plan, all the way from management goals and objectives to impacts, challenges and opportunities, adaptation, and finally developing strategies, and then moving to implement and monitor our actions after that. This process really works both ways. So as we finish our monitoring plans, our metrics are directly linked to measure the effectiveness of our adaptation tactics, which describe how we will implement our strategies and our overall concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition. And we can trace these to the management challenges and opportunities, the direct impacts on our systems for which we have identified our goals and objectives. And monitoring ultimately helps us know whether we are on track to meet those management goals and objectives. So hopefully that was clear as a bell. I think this is one of the easiest steps of the adaptation workbook. As long as you've completed all the other steps, this is one where brainstorming is really fun and you might be able to identify some new ways of tapping into existing monitoring networks. So with that, we'll take some questions, or again, if anyone knows of some other neat monitoring networks or other types of networks that we could be using for this step, go ahead and pipe up or use the chat box. And I'll stop sharing. Next, Courtney will give us some pro tips and tell us what we can expect in the future.
Awesome, thanks Patricia. And it looks like there's a couple questions popping up in the chat box. Oh, and I think you need to make me a co-host so I can share my screen.
I'm on it.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, one of the questions was from Jake asking why we were looking at survival of non-local plants in the example that you gave.
That was simply an example of what some forest managers have identified as a monitoring metric. So it was basically a random example taken from our experience based on a kind of a real life project. But it could be that your project is looking at the survivability of native species.
Yeah, I just was, I saw that I understood that it was example, but I thought in a way it would be a typo, because why would you want 60% of non-local species remain and see that? But if it's just an example, who knows? But I kind of found it odd that 60% should be non-local, or maybe I misread that graph.
Yeah, I don't know if I would get too hung up in the details of that. I know if it was the invasive species example, that when we were taking down the non-local plants to 20% coverage, and I think the 60% survival rate was more focused on future adapted species. And I don't know if we classified those as non-local per se, but they might be ones that are on the fringes of the range that that particular user was experimenting with and planting those species that hadn't existed in that particular site previously. Does that make more sense?
Sure. I wasn't sure whether I misread something, misunderstood something. That's why I wanted to ask back. But it's all okay.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Okay. And then it looks like Catherine suggested the FEMC and provided a link. So thank you. We'll have to check that out. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think Courtney, you can take it away.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thanks, Patricia. Hi, everyone. So as Patricia mentioned, I'm just going to quickly go through some tips for when you're working through step 5 in the adaptation workbook. And so just give you some ideas of how to complete that step as well as the homework. And then finally going into export and print your plan as a PDF so that you have a copy of all of the work that you've completed so far. And just as a quick reminder, don't forget that there's also the adaptation workbook tutorials that are available as you're working your way through there in case you have any additional questions, and they're embedded within each step. So you can find those as you're working through the process. And so when you pull up step 5, this is what you're going to see for adding a monitoring variable. And so you're going to want to click on the button so that you can add a monitoring variable, and then it'll give you the option for adding your variable, your criteria for evaluation, and your monitoring implementation. And so these are kind of the same examples that Patricia had covered. And so you'll want to think again about your intentionality and connecting back to your goals and objectives and the impacts you're addressing and the adaptation tactics that you came up with last week, and really think about your variable, your criteria for evaluation, and your implementation plan to address those tactics, and again, connect the dots. And then the next part of step 5 is to really think about how these monitoring variables apply back to your management goals and objectives. And so you're going to go through and think about how does this monitoring variable apply to your objectives for your project area. And you can go through and click either yes or no. This applies to this specific objective. And so that's how you'll be able to connect this step within the adaptation workbook. And then finally, the last thing is just to complete that homework for step 5. So be sure that you fill out some of these questions And then you'll want to go in and export and share your plan. And so once you hit the end of your homework for 5 and 6, there's a button at the very bottom that says export and share plan. And so you're going to want to print the current version of your adaptation workbook so that you can save this for your files. And so it'll pop up with a little button that says the climate adaptation plan has been formatted for printing and landscape mode. You just want to hit OK. And then you can save as a PDF onto your laptop or desktop and make sure that you save all of the work that you've done throughout the entire adaptation workbook process. So pretty easy. And then for next time, what you'll want to do is make sure you complete step 5. So monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of your tactics and your actions, complete the homework that comes up after step 5. And then if you're interested, there's the Genoviak et al. 2017 paper that goes into using forest inventory data and species distribution models if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that and some of the different ideas and suggestions for monitoring there. And so next week, we'll have our normal lecture on Monday, June 1st. And Kaylee is going to be going into communicating climate change. And then we'll also have some discussions next week on step 4 and step 5. And so be prepared for both the lecture and the discussion sections next week. And that's all we've got for you. So with that, we'll answer any additional questions you have and then call it a day.